Welcome to Reddit Aliens. What is the most shocking thing that someone confessed to while on their deathbed? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. I'm a medical student, and I had a female patient who was new to our practice who was HIV positive. I needed to ask her how she got the virus, i.e. sexual or IV drugs. She tells me it was sexually transmitted, and the only reason she got tested was because her partner of 3 years' last words to her as he was dying in hospice was, I'm sorry, I wanted to tell you, forgive me. Heavy stuff. I have a good and a bad story for this thread. I'll start with the good. It's not exactly on the deathbed, but as close as she was able at the time. My aunt had cancer. She knew she was going to die, and she knew it was probably be in less than a week. She couldn't eat, and drinking was hard. She wanted to be sedated heavily, kept asleep permanently, essentially, for the last few days because this whole dying thing sucks, and I've had more than enough. So, fair enough. A doctor is called up, a plan is made and carried out. The last thing my aunt said before going under for the rest of her life was, I see the stars. They're sweet and run carefree. Gather them up. And that's when she went under. She died 3 days later. Nobody knows what she meant, but somehow those last words fit her. So my uncle, her husband, got them tattooed on his chest over his heart. The bad. My other uncle had been in a car accident. It was bad. In the ambulance on the way to the hospital, he said, tell my wife that Wendy is my daughter and I love her. Name changed for privacy. He died a few minutes later because of internal bleeding. Wendy was the neighbor's then 5-year-old child. That caused a huge shitstorm, I can tell you. The good part of that story is sweet and poetic. The bad part, well, you could cue the Curb Your Enthusiasm theme song right there. My dad was adopted from a woman who went to my grandparents' church and got pregnant out of wedlock. My grandpa confessed on his deathbed that he had actually had an affair with that woman, and he was my dad's real father, which was why he suggested adopting him in the first place. Full circle. I was told by my father that in addition to 2 other kids he had that I knew of, there were more children of his out there. Also, that only 2 of his kids were with the same woman. 4 of them showed up at his service, in addition to the other 2, making it 7 of his present. We also found out that he may have had other kids elsewhere, but my family kept really poor records of things, so I have never found out who they are. Most of that was word of mouth from old friends of his. Weird note, but all of us got together and now stay in contact. We had a good amount in common and see each other when we can. My mother died when I was 11 of stage 4 cancer. While she was on hospice at home, my grandmother on my dad's side was standing by the bed. She woke up heavily medicated, pointed, and said, "What are you doing here? I never liked you." Not especially shocking, but hilarious. It sounds heartless, but my grandmother gave my mom hell when she was alive. My other grandmother, mom's mom, tried to hold in laughter as she told her she taught her better than that. As my mother lay in hospice bed dying of cancer, she beckoned me closer to her and said, I've hidden the money in the... She was having trouble speaking and getting breath, and her voice was cracking. She tried one last time. The money's in the... She closed her eyes. Her breath stopped, and her head slumped to one side. A few seconds later, she burst out laughing. She was pranking me. She died 3 days later. Short and sweet that it was, this one affected me more than any of the other stories today. It mattered. My grandpa told my dad he loved him for the first time when he was dying from cancer. Grandpa was a drunk all throughout my dad's childhood and had a strained relationship with the family, so this was pretty surprising to hear from that. I like that. My mom told me about the death of her father, my grandfather, and his last words to her. She said he was on his deathbed, and it was obvious he was nearing the end. He motioned her over to tell her something. She went over, leaned in close, expecting some declaration of his love for her or some deeply insightful. He said, "The good family silverware is hidden in the ventilation system about 15 feet out from the furnace." She looked at him like he was crazy. He said, "What? We traveled a lot, and that's where I hid it. That shit's expensive." He died the next morning. I met a lady on a train to Edinburgh who was really nervous because she was on the way to meet her brother for the first time in 70 years. Her parents had told her that he died when he was 1, but they'd given him away because they couldn't afford so many kids. She didn't find out he was still alive until her mother confessed it on her deathbed. Me and all of my cousins were gathered around my grandfather's hospice bed as he lay dying. Each and every one of my cousins, there's a lot of us, gave him a kiss and tried to talk to him and said they loved him, etc. But he wouldn't respond to any of them, just stared, until I came up. I sat on the edge of his bed, holding his hand. Everyone was watching us. He looked at me and said, "I don't like Mexican food." And that was it. I have a great aunt that passed away when I was 17. Just before she did, my older brother confessed to her that I was gay. She called me in and explained how our family had been through so much and that she was willing to totally accept me for who I am. I think that is great of her to be that open-minded. Only one problem: I'm not gay. She never believed me because my brother had confessed it. My mum was from China, though we are now happily residing in a European country. We went back to China for my grandmother's last few weeks as she was dying from terminal cancer. On my grandma's last days, she requested that mum stay with her alone, and it was only then she revealed that my mum wasn't her biological kid. My grandma confessed that she had bought my mom from a child trafficking ring, which was common in China, because she had tried for many years and still couldn't get pregnant. My mother cried a lot, not only for the unimaginable pain that her biological parents likely went through in losing a baby, but also for the fact that my grandparents have went beyond to treat my mom as their little princess. They literally did treat my mom as their own. They were never abusive and only gave her the very best in life. They even willingly send my mom to the US for university education, even though they aren't rich by any means. Well, it was intended to be a deathbed confession, but she pulled through. My girlfriend's mom told my girlfriend her birth father's name after saying she didn't know. She was whoring around and couldn't remember. It was Orange County in the 80s, and apparently my future mother-in-law effed and did drugs with most of the lowlifes in Southern California. But she did know who my girlfriend's dad was, and finally told her after 30-plus years. Turns out, he now lived less than 3 blocks away in our small town of Mojave Desert. His kids look exactly like my girlfriend did at their age. We didn't make contact, as his criminal record is a mile long, and he's a shitty person by all evidence. My mother worked as a nurse in the biggest hospital in Copenhagen. A dude is terminally ill with cancer, has his wife, children, and entire family next to him. He decides before he dies that he was going to phone the girl he was cheating on his wife to meet up at the hospital when the entire family was there. My mother had to move the entire family into another room when she showed up because of massive shouting and hysteria. What a selfish prick he was. My grandfather was in the hospital in a pretty nasty state. He barely could speak, but he made it clear to us he had something to say. He had my mother get him a piece of paper and a pen, thinking he has some important words to leave us with in case he doesn't have the chance later. My mom does just that. There's silence in the room as he scribbles something onto the paper, with my mother and her 2 siblings waiting in anticipation. My grandfather finishes, and with a big smile turns the paper for us to see. "I've got a girlfriend," it read, as he pointed to Anna, a neighbor and friend of his. The goofball ended up pulling through and living several more years. My grandfather was dying of cancer. He was 90. Our entire family would sit with him in his own home, tending to him in shifts, making sure everyone had alone time with him and to all feel needed and loved during his passing. Gramps would regularly point to a spot where no one was and say, "Hello, Hazel. They are all here again," and then smile. Or he'd say, "Yes, dear, that's Linda's little girl." Hazel was his wife, my grandmother, who had passed away 2 decades prior. The chilling bit was that Grandpa would then turn to us and say, "Oh, I forgot you can't see her." Shortly after he was diagnosed as suffering from the final stages of heart failure, a few weeks before he died, my grandfather told me several stories about World War II that changed my view of him and of war in general. Now, before I start, I should tell you that my grandfather was one of the kindest men you'd ever meet. Always friendly, never drank, the kind of guy who gave you the shirt off his back to those who needed it, and handed out the biggest candy bars in town on Halloween. Everyone loved him. Shortly after D-Day, my grandfather was part of a 12-man rifle squad firing in northern France. As his unit entered a seemingly abandoned village, they were ambushed by a squad of Germans, and the unit was torn apart. They won, but by the end of the fight, only 3 of the Americans were still alive, and one of them was badly wounded. The squad leader and his assistant were dead. The 2 unwounded soldiers swept the battle scene and hauled 3 badly wounded German Wehrmacht soldiers into the middle of the street. My grandfather looked at the other American soldier, said, "No prisoners," and cut the throat of one of the Germans right there. He said he almost puked because there was way more blood than he was expecting. His partner lifted his rifle to shoot the other 2, but my grandfather stopped them. He said that there may have been other German soldiers nearby and didn't want the gunfire attracting them. So they dragged the other 2 into the shallow ditch on the side of the road with about 6 inches of water in it and stood on the German soldiers' heads until they drowned. After that, he said he hated Germans. He confessed to a number of war crimes, including shooting German civilians and killing German soldiers who were trying to surrender, apparently a not uncommon occurrence. But the worst? He told me that he only felt guilty about one thing he'd done. In early 1945, his new squad was going through a small German village when he and a couple of other guys kicked in the door to a small house. Inside was a small, old German woman in a wheelchair, who immediately started screaming and cursing at them in perfect English. My grandfather kicked her wheelchair over, rolled it out the door, and then knocked an oil lamp over as he left the house with his partners. She burned to death. He looked at me with cold eyes and said, "That was too cruel. She was an old woman. I should have just shot her. Damn." My father apologized to my mother for the way his side of the family had treated her, especially in the first few months after the wedding, and the months leading up to his death. This same family screamed and shouted as the hearse was leaving the house to go to the cemetery about how much they didn't get from the will. After 30 years, I have, for the first time, attempted to reach out to one of them that actually apologized some 5 to 10 years ago. My dad had an impacted bowel and was heavily medicated. Before he went in for exploratory surgery, he tried to write a letter to me expressing his feelings. He could barely talk before he went into surgery. He kissed me and had tears in his eyes, knowing it was the end. The paper was folded and said on the front, "Only open if I die." While he was in surgery, I selfishly opened it. It was a few paragraphs of unreadable scribbles that I couldn't read. He made it through the surgery, but also got C. diff, since the hospital sucked at washing him, so he was put into hospice, which is basically where you're put to die. I know this isn't quite that bad, but if he died, I'd never know what the note said, and it would weigh for me on my entire life. He later told me, "It probably said how much I loved you, and wish I did more for you or some shit. You know, dad stuff. He's the best." My grandmother confessed to my mom when she thought she was dying, she got better, that she tried to coat hanger abort her. Obviously, it was unsuccessful. My grandma was a religious woman and decided that God wanted her to have this baby and treated my mom like her favorite child. This messed my mom up for a while, and it was even more awkward when my grandma surprisingly got better. After grandma died for real, my mom eventually made peace with it. After she was born, grandma never treated her like she was unwanted, so mom understood she was in a vulnerable place at the time. Mom was the 7th child in a poor family. Yay, the time before birth control. Not exactly his deathbed, but he was on the verge of death and couldn't speak after this. My father confessed to me that I had a sister that he never told me about. He had fathered a child with a woman right before he and my mother got married, and his parents paid the woman off to go away. That was 18 years ago. We're now good friends, the sister and I, and she is a welcome part of my extended family. Sometimes actions truly do speak louder than words. I'm happy for you that you had a moment like that. When my great-grandfather died, me, my cousin, and my dad visited him in the hospital right before he passed. When we were leaving, both my father and cousin gave him a hug and said their goodbyes. I did the same, but when I was about to move away, he grabbed my hand and held me there for a few more seconds. I was always close to my great-grandparents, closer than any of my siblings or cousins, but he never showed how much he loved me until that moment, No words, just holding on one last time. His death is the hardest I'd had to deal with, much because of that moment. My grandpa, when he was dying, he awoke after being asleep for most of the day, and it was around 2 a.m., and me and my cousin were on watch to wake up my mother, who's a nurse, if anything was going wrong. He sat straight up, looked right through me as if I wasn't there, and started talking to his sister, who had passed decades before. He loved her so much, and always talked about how much he missed her. He was having a conversation. "Hey Lena, I've missed you. It hurts." Followed by unintelligible mumbling and groaning. It wasn't so much what he said, but how he said it, as if she was standing in my place or right behind me. He didn't even acknowledge me, and it really kind of freaked me out. The next one, which is actually a cherished memory, was when my grandmother from the other side of my family was in hospice and on her way out. Her and I always used to joke about death and how it was shocking she was the last of my grandparents, as she smoked, drank, and stayed up all hours of the night watching TV. She was my best friend for my whole life, and really, I wish I would have known it was the last time we would speak. She was in her hospital bed, then looked at me as I held her hand, and she says, "I'm ready now." "You want the Jell-O now, Grandma?" I asked her. She genuinely guffawed and said, No, I'm ready. I'm ready to go chase rainbows." And she relaxed and said she was tired and wanted a nap. My son, who was 2 at the time, said, "I love you," as we laughed, and she was the second person he ever said that to. I'm crying just thinking about it. She was such an awesome woman. Miss you, Grandma.